Just J-Mike.
Hello, my darlings. Welcome to 2024 with Generation Mix Podcast, aka GMP, with your host, Jolie. So I hope y'all holidays was really good and wonderful. No matter how you celebrated, I hope it was great. And today's episode, I have another reprise guest who is an amazing human being. Her name's Daralyse Lyons. She was on my episode 46, Transformational Storyteller. So she's back with us today because she has exciting news since her last visit. And Daralyse, I want to thank you again for coming on to my show. How are you, honey?
Oh, I'm doing great. Thank you so much for having me. And thanks to everyone listening. This is a really fun opportunity and I'm happy to be back again.
So here's the news, y'all. Since the last time we talked, she actually has a podcast of her own that was amazing. It's called On Being Biracial. Now, I'm not going to give out any goodies. I want Daralyse to take the stage. Honey, tell me the evolution of this project that you had from beginning to end. What happened?
Oh, yeah. Thank you so much. I know just before airing, we were talking about getting sick. And so what happened was I had COVID and I was out of commission. I was down and out for a good 2 weeks. And I emerged from that experience, that period of time. And I thought, you know what? I really want to do a project. I want to do a creative project that is deeply personal to me. And I'd already been doing the Demystifying Diversity podcast where we interviewed hundreds of people about their experiences with diversity, equity, and inclusion, their different identities and backgrounds and, just life experiences. But I wanted to do something about being biracial. And so I called Malcolm Burnley, who was at that time just a vague colleague and acquaintance, but I've always admired his work. He's always admired my work. And we've now become friends. And I said, hey, do you want to do this project with me about being biracial? And he was all in. And so we proceeded then to get some funding. We did a series on youth voices where we interviewed youths age 4 to 21 about their life experiences. And then we interviewed 30 grown folks about their experiences in love, in life, in school, growing up, in their families, just all the different things that people experience coming from multiracial backgrounds. And we put together for season 1 and then season 2 of the On Being Biracial podcast. And it's really been such a gift. And also I want to give a huge shout out to, it's not just Malcolm and me. We had a team. I know, Jolie, you have a team working behind the scenes. And so Emily Previty did all of our editing. We got funding from the Resolve Journalistic Collective, Journalistic Collaborative, which is an organization of 29 partner newsrooms based in Philly. We have an audio engineer, Paul Kondo, who's amazing. We just had so much support and buy-in for this project and got to speak with some phenomenal people as you do in your work. So it's been really exciting and really meaningful.
Love that. So you talked about how it sounded like there were 2 sets of interviews. There was ones with the youth and ones with the 30, matured people. Now, between those 2 groups, because I'm curious, did you find any similarities between the youth group and the 30 people, like in terms of their upbringing? The only reason why I'm asking this is because I noticed that the younger generation, at least in California, could be totally different somewhere else. Out here, they don't have a lot to say about growing up mixed because there's a lot of mixed people out here. So they didn't have the growing pains, the identity crises as hard as we have. But I don't know if you had any different results. So what are your comparisons?
Yeah, that is really interesting to hear you talk about that, because we did notice a lot of geographical differences, for people who grew up multiracial and in an environment surrounded by different multiracial people. They're like, oh yeah, this is just a Tuesday, right? But yes, for folks who didn't maybe see that representation, I think it is different, and their challenges are different. The way that they navigate the world is different. I think one of the overall themes that spanned ages and generations was just this idea, not so much of being multiracial, but multicultural, like being, being exposed to different cultural influences. I also think belonging is something that came up a lot in the conversations, and identity, and people identify differently. I mean, some people identified as mixed or multiracial or biracial or multicultural, and some people were like, no, that doesn't resonate for me. You know, I'm Black, I'm Latina, I'm Indigenous, I'm white, and that's valid as well, right? That just sort of, I think one of my big takeaways was that people should be free to claim their own identities and their own experiences. And I'm not talking about like Rachel Dolezal or anything like that, but I mean, right? Just sort of like that. Like we can't look at someone and know who they are, what they've been through, how they identify, what matters to them. And so, I think I learned a lot, but there were some commonalities. There was also for me a lot of hope, because this younger generation, as you sort of alluded to, like being multiracial might be the fifth most interesting thing about them. But I think, I'm 40, and I think people sort of my age or older, and I also want to see that it really depends on how people look and how they present. Because I think those of us who are maybe more phenotypically multiracial or more ethnically ambiguous in terms of our presentation, I think that those people have a lot of different life experiences than folks who maybe appear to be monoracial, even if they are mixed. So it's a very complicated conversation, so many layers, but it was exciting to do this project and to look at what people have been through, and sort of how people make sense of their stories and their experiences.
So I caught on, you said a little bit earlier, you said you learned some things throughout this. So I want to know, what insights did you get from your guests, and which guests, like their insight totally made you relook at something totally different? Because I'm sure you found those nuggets of wisdom and stuff.
For sure. And before I go into speaking about the guests, I just want to give a big shout out to Malcolm, because he and I, although we're both Black and white biracial, I think we have navigated the world very differently in terms of our experiences, in terms of sort of how we've been received. I think gender may also have something to do with that as a complicating factor. But it was really interesting to work on this project with someone who, although his identity mirrors mine in many ways, we came to it with different lenses, I think, and different ways of filtering and interpreting. So just kind of writing these pieces behind the scenes and having conversations about what we took away from the guests, in and of itself, I learned so much. And then it's hard to shout out specific guests, because I don't want to leave anyone out.
Yes.
But I will say that some of the things that really surprised me, there's a John Blake who wrote a book about, you've interviewed John, so you should be linked to that in your show notes. But maybe I shouldn't give away too much of his story, but John grew up Black identifying, knowing only that his mother was white, and that his family, her family hates Black people, right? And that's what he was told. And then he found out that the story of what he thought was very, very different. And so speaking with him was really interesting. Speaking with Rachel Go, who is someone who identified as white until she was, I think, like a mother of twins. And so talking to her about her experience and how actually being multiracial has been a huge shaping force in her life, even though she didn't acknowledge it. I spoke with Jordan, who you've interviewed, about his experiences being a member of white supremacist group. Got to speak with W. Kamau Bell, Lisa Funderburg. I mean, just so many people, both who have spoken extensively about their experiences of race and written about it, and then people who hadn't spoken about it really ever before and were willing to have that conversation in a very public forum. And so it's hard to single out individual people, but I think what I walked away with was a profound sense of gratitude that I grew up in an environment where I was always given the choice to identify like as for myself. Like no one ever kind of told me who I had to be or what I had to be. And so I was really grateful for that. And also, I think on a personal note, some of the things that I've always thought of as my personality, I realize may have been impacted by my racial identity. Like I'm a person who has never shied away from being the first or the only, or, like trying new things, yeah. And there's like a level of bravery and individuality to my personality. But I also think I'm not always super comfortable in group environments. I'm definitely, I think belonging has been fraught for me. Some self-esteem issues that I've always attributed to gender. I think like there may have been a racial component. So that it complicated my sense of self in a way that I think is good. I think we should all always be curious about ourselves. And so it's a project that I think has already changed my life and will continue to. I'm really grateful that I got to do it.
I love that. That's beautiful. So now I'm wondering about one other question. You don't have to name names or cherry pick any particular guests, but what are some of the saddest stories you've ever heard? Because I interviewed one woman, Amber, who was related to Hitler. You know what I mean? And how that kind of affected the family and things like that. So anything jarring or anything that was sad that you found, you're like, wow.
Yeah, I think the biggest things that were hard to listen to and certainly hard for people to experience were family interactions and then peer interactions. Like some of the things that people told about being in school and the ways that people spoke with them or didn't. I mean, there was a lot of bullying that happened in the guests that we spoke with, some in the youth voices, but certainly more for grown folks. I think that is a mark of the changing times. That was really sad. And then, some people grew up not knowing their families or having rifts in their families and going to barbecues knowing that dad wasn't invited or mom wasn't invited because of the color of their skin or, so it, yeah. And then some dating things, like people spoke about being called the N-word and in dating situations or, not being free to love who they loved or having, I mean, it was just, there was a lot that was actually like very disturbing. I don't want to make the podcast sound disturbing because I think it's hopeful and healing, but I don't think we can move forward individually or collectively without an acknowledgement of the pain that people have experienced as a result of this. Lisa Funderburg called it a fucked up construct, and race is a fucked up construct.
Yes.
And so, yeah.
I very, very true. Well, I think what it is too is it just kind of reminds me, especially those of us who are older, mixed races. It's like, think of the civil rights era. Look at all the people who had to go through the dogs and the spray and like getting food thrown at them, sitting at a all white diner or whatever, to where the next generation, it was a little bit easier. So I think with us, we were that group. We are that group in the mixed race community. We're going through the gauntlet so the kids behind us don't have to go through the same gauntlet that we did.
Well, I think that's such a valid point that you bring up. And I think the complicating layer is that many of us, and this is different for folks who are multiracial, who are from two underrepresented or minority races. But I think myself, who comes from a background where one of my identities racially has been highly privileged and the other has not, I think there's like this unique tension that we hold moving through the world with this, like a sense of, yes, I am, my existence is resistance, right? And like this sense of being a person who is advocating for rights and moving in that direction. But then also this sense of like, maybe it's not for me to be taking up all the space, or maybe, or acknowledging that I have had certain privileges or certain access as a result of my racial identity, but I've also not had certain, so it's that there's a weird dynamic. And I think that is something that differed definitely between people who came from two underrepresented racial identities or who presented as monoracial from an underrepresented identity versus people who maybe looked a little more ambiguous or had some skin privilege and maybe came from a background where there's whiteness in the mix. And so it's hard to really tease apart, but that's something that I thought about a lot during production.
Totally. Yeah. I like those insights. You see, I'm learning right now with the stuff you're telling me, you know what I mean? Because I haven't had the guests like that yet. You know what I mean? From somebody like Rachel, right? Or
Rachel Go. Yeah.
Oh, sorry, honey, if I mispronounced your name. And I've never had those type of exposure. So it's good that you're telling me this stuff, because now I'm being exposed to certain things that I haven't been exposed to yet as a podcaster. You know what I mean? With the guests that I've had. So it's really interesting. And then speaking of podcasting, because I'm sure you get this. When you tell people you're a podcaster, do you ever get, I want to be a podcaster too? Do you get that all the time? Because I do.
Yeah, I think I used to more so, because I think now that podcasts have become more ubiquitous and more sort of mainstream, I think people feel like if they want to be a podcaster, they can be. But certainly, I have a lot of people who have reached out to me to be like, how do you do what you do? And can we talk about this? Or people will make random introductions if I go to a party and they ask what I do and I say I'm a podcaster. They'll be like, oh, Steve, come over here, meet Daralyse. Like, Steve wants to start a podcast about money. Like, tell him how to do it.
Yes.
That's not really what I do, but okay. So yeah, it's kind of,
well, that's because
we're really a conversation starter. I also have had people in the very beginning, not so much anymore, but when I was just starting out in my career, people would be like, yeah, but that's not, like, what do you really do? Like, that's not really.
Really? This is a job, you guys. It is a job. We don't just sit in front of a microphone and a screen and just start talking randomly. It's work behind it. And see, with me, when I get students, because I work at a community college, and I tell them, okay, I'm going to give you a quick rundown of what you're going to have to deal with as a podcaster based on my limited experience, because I'm still learning and growing. I said, number one, pre-production and post-production are important. Pre-production tells you, that keeps you in line while you're interviewing or during the recording of what you're going to ask, so you don't go all over the place. I said post-production is important because you need to wrap everything up and it has to go to copy, and this is what the world's going to see. I tell them there are going to be issues in terms of getting guests. They may flake. We may postpone. Something may happen. I said there's going to be technical difficulties. Yep. There's going to be, I don't know. Sometimes I've had a couple of guests that I just let them run away. I'm like, I can't control this. Like, they'll go off on a tangent on their podcast. And I'm like, okay, I think I'm just going to let you talk, because I think for some people, when they come on a podcast, it's something that is very releasing to them. Like, it's something that they needed to tell and they haven't been able to. It's like a catharsis for them. And some of them, I just run away, let them, yeah. And sometimes that's not good, because you want to keep somewhat of a balance. So that's a few of my things. Have you given them any people similar advice or something different?
Yeah, I mean, so this podcast is interview based. There's a number of different types of podcasts, and so I've done both interview based podcasts, which are somewhat similar to this, like talking to a guest. There's a lot of preparation in advance to make sure that there's a coherent sort of flow and a give and take and all that. And then the two podcast projects that I've worked on most recently, which were On Being Biracial and Demystifying Diversity, are scripted podcasts. So if anyone's ever listened to like This American Life or, anything like that, it's a little more, we do interviews, but then the interviews themselves don't run continually. So we get to kind of splice up what guests say and have a connective thread and weave things in throughout. There's a lot that doesn't make it onto the podcast, a lot that we sort of omit behind the scenes. And so in that way, I don't mind if a guest goes on and on and on, because it doesn't make it to the final cut. And sometimes at the end of a stream of consciousness, there's some golden nugget that we get to weave in. But it is, I think in some ways, the interviews themselves are more challenging with what you're doing, because you have to like really engage and stay focused. And sometimes people don't even answer the question that you asked. And it's like, oh no, do I re-ask them? And what do I do? So that I think is a little harder in the moment. But then your post-production is probably a little easier, let's say, or more straightforward than having to then write an entire script and try to puzzle in these different voices. So I think it's it's so different. And I think the skill set is very different as a podcaster. And then there's some people who just, they don't interview anyone and they just come on and they tell a little story or whatever, that maybe it's a narrative podcast. So there's so many different forms that this medium can take. And I think for me, the one connective thread is that it is much harder than it looks. It's harder than it seems like it would be.
Yes. And it's I don't know if you tell people this, but I do. I said, can I just tell you guys one more thing? I'm a podcaster. I'm not rolling in money like Joe Rogan or any of these. I have a job outside of this, and you have to realize, especially when you're podcasting, the money's not going to start rolling in immediately unless you have some really strong investors in your product. It's going to take time. I said, if you're going to do a podcast and you're really serious about it and passionate, commit yourself as best as you can, because there's so many podcasts out there that 1 or 2 episodes and they're gone, or 10 and they're gone. You really have to commit yourself to something that's going to be long term, because if one of your goals is to be having a more wider reach in the social media network, you're going to have to put a lot of years in until more and more people start noticing you. And you're not going to have the money rolling in. I tell people, I am not making any money. You do it for love. And you're not supposed to focus on money, because then you're going to lose what the original mission is of your podcast. Because you don't want to do it for clout or likes or whatever, to be controversial or what, you know what I mean? You kind of still want to have your integrity and do what you're going to do, and realize in the end, it's going to be great if I get it. But if it isn't, that's okay too. You also have to accept that. Not everybody's going to be, top of the charts. You got to be comfortable with what you end up with and be okay with it as well.
Yeah. And I think people have different goals with their podcasts. I mean, mine, thankfully, I won't say it's been lucrative, but I have gotten paid to do it, which is amazing. And the opportunities that have come out of that have been really pretty incredible. I mean, doing the Demystifying Diversity podcast, I then had the opportunity to do a TED Talk. I think from the On Being Biracial podcast, I was able to sell a children's book that won't come out until 2025. But so it's hard to quantify the financial wins, the financial gains, but I can tell you it's very expensive if you want to hire an audio engineer and you want to do all that, and but everyone has different goals and different whys for doing this. And some people use their content for a book, or they take a book that they've written and they use that and repurpose it through a podcast. And so it's hard to know whether or not it's going to add value, or whether or not someone's going to make money either directly or tangentially. But I think overall, if someone feels like they have something to say and they want to share it with the world, this is an accessible medium where you can sort of work at whatever level you have available to you. I mean, there's great behind the scenes programming and like to script and things, so people can do it on their own. I mean, I don't have the technical skill to be able to create what we created alone, but people can, and there's different qualities and different. So and when I go back and listen to my Transformational Storyteller podcast that I did 3 podcasts ago, my first podcast, I'm a different podcaster and my skill set is different today, but I feel like I had to start somewhere, and I still love that content. There's such value to it. So, I don't know. It's an interesting arena.
It is. Oh, now I haven't gotten this yet, but have you? Because when you're doing something really good, you get haters that say stuff or post stuff. I haven't gotten anything yet. Maybe I'm not that big on the chart yet, but have you received anything like that?
Yeah. I mean, in my life, yeah. Not the On Being Biracial podcast. I don't think. When I did my TED Talk, there was some interesting feedback. But I don't know. I'm a writer, and so I'm very used to rejection. Like I kind of feel like if people are engaging, I appreciate that in whatever way that they're engaging. So yeah, I think what would be harder for me is if I put work out and it just went into the void and there was no feedback, no acknowledgement, no listens. No, yeah. So yeah, I don't mind people not liking it. I just want them to have heard of it.
Yes, yes. And thinking about haters, I just ran across one of my friends was telling me something about Black separatists and how they view us. And this is something new for me because I never even thought about that community, how they hate us and they call us like, words that we don't like and stuff like that. And I haven't really delved into that subject too much. All I know is based on that initial conversation, I'm like, okay, this is people from our own community, those of us who are half Black and half white, so to speak, or mixed with Black and whatever, that are already calling us these derogatory names, and we don't belong. And this is part of where the whole problem is with us being mixed race, trying to identify, trying to find a place to belong. When we have groups like this that are out there saying you will never belong, you're nothing but nothing. You know what I mean? Yeah. So I just wonder, what are your thoughts on that whole situation?
I mean, I think to me that's a different sort of pain and a different come from than white folks who might say that. And I understand where it comes from. Like, I understand that if you've been fighting for your identity and there's been pains associated with that someone like me might be threatening or problematic in many ways, because I have had access to Black spaces and white spaces and in between spaces and Latinx spaces, even though I'm not Latina, right? Like there's a level of fluidity to my movement that I understand where that comes from. I understand that, when Barack Obama gets elected and everyone says, it's our first ever Black president. It is. And I don't want to take that away from him. However, there's a way that saying that without an acknowledgement of the nuanced nature of his racial identity makes it seem like there's been a level of progress that has happened for Black folks that may not be true, that may not mirror certain people's experiences. I think there's some statistics out there. I'm not sure they may be a few years out of date, but that, a light-skinned individual and a dark-skinned individual can go in for a job interview. And if that dark-skinned individual even has more qualifications, the light-skinned person is more likely to get that. There's still research on resumes and names. And so I think that it comes from a place that is perhaps misguided, but also rooted in pain and experience and pride too, right? I think it's beautiful to say, this is my identity and I'm proud of it. And I love where I come from and I want to be who I am. And I'd say you identify the same, but I don't relate to you. And so I just think it's very nuanced, and I'm not going to condemn that come from or that feeling, but I just know that, for me, hate generates more hate, love generates more love. So I'd rather come from a place of seeing what people have in common than condemning people or judging them or not liking them, because I kind of feel like that's how we got to this mixed up place in the first place.
Yes. But you know what else I've just noticed too? Because I've started delving into Reddit because there's subreddits. The subreddit called Am I the Asshole? I've done a few actually. And there's a lot with mixed race content. And what I'm noticing in some of the ones that I spoke about on my episodes, there's already starting to be gatekeeping within our own mixed race community. And I'm like, can we not emulate what happened to us outside of our own community and create the same problems even more so? You know what I mean? And it's like I'd read some of these Reddit posts and I'm like, oh, you're white and Latina. You're not mixed race like me because I'm Black and white. And it's like, no, we're all mixed race. We're going to have different experiences, but don't forget the common connection is we're mixed race. You're going to have differences and similarities, but don't alienate somebody or shut them out just because of the skin tone or the hair or whatever. Let's not fall into that trap. You know what I mean?
It's fascinating. I interviewed Sarah Gaither, who's a research professor at Duke University, and she's a white presenting Black and white mixed race person. And she's done a lot of research about identity questioning, but she also advises college students. And one of the things that she shared was that, when there's identity caucuses, the Latinx caucus and the Black caucus and the Asian caucus, when there's a mixed race caucus, there's actually often less parallels of experience because people like one of the things that I found interviewing a bunch of Black and white mixed race people is that they're like, oh yeah, I got asked all the time, what are you? What are you? What are you? But some other people who might be mixed didn't get that question. And so, it's a little bit different from them. Some people come from cultural backgrounds or racial backgrounds where there tends to be more of a embracing of who they are within their community. And some people come from backgrounds where there's a little more exclusion, right? Like a sense of like, oh no, you're not Asian enough, or you're not Jewish really, so you can't. And I think that and that can happen with folks of any identity, Black, Indigenous, Latin, just you name it. I think that multiracial people, there's often this belief in the sense that like, oh, we've got so much in common, but I don't know that that's always true. Actually, I think there's so much diversity within like the multiracial experience that it can be hard. But like, how can we make space for both? How can I say like, okay, yes, we're all multiracial in this space, and your experiences are going to be very different than my experience because we're from different backgrounds, or because we grew up in a different time, or in a different geographical location, or a different country, or whatever, or we have different sexual orientations or gender identities or whatever. But I feel like those conversations are not the conversations that people are having or looking to have. And I wish there was more of that. I wish there was more of an anding, like a yes anding instead of a no butting kind of culture.
Yes. See, that kind of ties into what I was going to ask is about, what can we do as a multiracial community to go forward from here? Because as I was saying earlier, we have our podcast, we had Mixed-ish, we have some movies, I get it. But what else can we do to make our presence be even more known and felt and validated, and more eyes on us and our experience, and making us a more integral part of society? Like, I'm wondering, where do we go? We're doing the foundation, but what's next for us? What else can we do to make our community stronger, more recognized, more connected? Like, what else can we do?
Yeah, it's so interesting. I feel like the first step is to recognize where that's already being done. I mean, there's so many people out there. You might turn on TV and like so many of the actors on screen right now are multiracial. So many of the musicians, so many of the educators, just people with athletes, right? Like so many people out there doing this life thing are coming from a multiracial background. And I think that owning that, acknowledging that is really important. And then also, I guess I really feel like the more that people can be who they are authentically, and I don't mean by that everyone who comes from a multiracial background has to identify as multiracial or mixed or biracial or whatever, but just like the more that people can be true to themselves and own their own experiences and tell their own stories, and not feel like, oh, because my grandmother felt this way, I gotta say I'm this, or because my dad is such and such, or my like, oh, I gotta fit into this friend group, so I'm gonna claim this space. I think just the more people can be authentically themselves, the better. And also like the conversation, I think identity conversations are essential and incredibly important, but we're also more than our identities. And there's so many overlapping and intersecting and dynamic identities. Like, I am biracial, and I'm also a woman, and I'm also bisexual, and I'm also a daughter, and I'm also a friend and a sister, and like weird and quirky, and I have IBS, like I have Ehlers-Danlos syndrome, like what, right? So I think the more we can just be well-rounded humans living our multifaceted, multidimensional, dynamic lives, owning the truth of who we are in the world and going after what makes us happy, and being in communities, numbers of different communities, some of which might have to do with race, some of which might not. Like, I don't know. I kind of feel like I don't think everyone has to be a crusader. I don't think everyone has to fight for the right to take up space. I think just by being who they are in their lives unapologetically, like they're doing something to make space for everyone else who holds a similar identity, who might want to see themselves represented so that they could then have permission to be their own unapologetic self.
Yeah. But I'm also thinking too about like healthcare, for instance, how being mixed race and mental health, that's a little bit different. That's really a big challenge that a lot of mental health professionals would have to be trained in or something. And I think we need to look at that aspect, because I don't know if there's enough resources out there. I don't know, but we have a lot of biracial therapists out there too. But what about those? Not everybody's going to be a therapist. So how do we get that sort of training and knowledge given to these other health professionals that never had to think about this in the past, since we're just a bigger community now? Even the East versus West medicine, you have those. How do we conjoin that? How do we combine that? I see those two as the biggest challenge with us being mixed race, with the health system in itself.
Oh, yeah. The medical system, the educational system, like I'm trying to think of what else, but I think there's a lot of systemic ignorance. And even I mentioned Sarah Gaither, like she spoke about this on the podcast, but she went to a doctor and they asked her to fill out a form, and for race, she put black and white, and they were like, oh, I don't know what to do with your bones. Like we can't, like it was like an osteopenia study or an osteoporosis study or something. Oh, and so wow. I think, like there's such a lack of understanding around being a multiracial person and how healthcare is supposed to meet us. And I've seen it too. Like one of my closest friends, we were talking about gynecological health among women, and she's a Black woman, and she was like, oh, how like they do, like they treat us this way. And I was like, oh, actually, like I've never had that experience, because I don't think my healthcare providers see me as a Black woman, but I also don't think they see me as a white woman. So there's a I feel like the more there is, and you alluded to this, but like there's multiracial people practicing therapy. I think the more there's multiracial doctors, the more multiracial is a category in studies, I think the better, because to me, there's a difference just being asked by a random person on the street, like, what are you? And then being asked for research purposes and scientific purposes, because there is sort of a black hole. There's a void out in the world where they don't know, like, what is the lifespan estimate for someone who's multiracial? I don't think they know that in the same way that they have it for white people and Black people and Latinx people and Indigenous people. And and what are the conflating factors? Like you mentioned mental health, and biracial folks, myself included, have been the most at risk historically as a racial group for mental health challenges. And I never thought about it until doing the On Being Biracial podcast, but I think my eating disorder had some roots in my racial identity. And so I think that awareness is really important, that being willing to acknowledge the complexity, doing studies that take multiracial experience and identity into consideration, believing people about their experiences,
their pain level. Let's not talk about that. Yeah.
And then the East versus West thing, though, I think that goes beyond just the racial conversation. Like, I think healthcare, we can have a whole conversation about how healthcare in this country looks at symptoms versus root causes. And I think, they're just overall, like, should be more of a movement to holistic wellness and treating people like multifaceted people as opposed to body parts, and but I could go on and on about that, and I don't know that you want me to.
Well, what we're gonna do then is switch back to you then, honey. I want to know what your future plans are. You hinted at a book.
Yes.
Can you tell us any info about that yet, or it's still in production?
Yeah. So the title is Biracial Like Me, and it'll be coming out in 2025. The publisher is Charles Bridge, wonderful publisher of children's books, and it's a picture book. I think they're in the process now of securing an illustrator. I love the text, but it was exciting and it was fun to write. And my part of it is over. So what am I working on now? I'm writing some YA fiction. I think I've got a nonfiction book in me that I'm planning and working on. But honestly, like podcasting, I love it and it is hard work. And so I'm very excited to have a break from interviewing people, very excited to have a break from writing scripts. And I'm an introvert. So like, I just want to take a nap, for a little while and recharge my batteries. So yeah, there's some projects in the work, but I'm also open to different things. And speaking of the mental health component, I live in Philadelphia. There are some wonderful organizations in Philadelphia, Mural Arts, which is connected to the Porchlight Foundation, and First Person Arts, the 3 organizations in Philadelphia are raising awareness about suicide and suicide prevention. And so I am directing and curating an event for them in March where we're going to have storytellers speak about their experiences being impacted by suicide, whether that's losing a loved one or themselves having ideation or attempts. And we're putting on an event and an experience connected with that. And then there's a wonderful muralist who is creating a mural based off of the stories that are told. And so that's a really exciting, meaningful project that's close to my heart that I'm working on. And that'll be coming out again in March. So I feel like that's the big focus for right now.
I love it. I love it. Do you have any final words, my darling?
Oh my gosh, this has been such a wonderful and joyful and complicated conversation. I think, how long have you been doing your podcast, Jolie? Because it's been a while now.
2 years, maybe, something like that.
Yeah. What have you found to be the changes in the conversations folks are having about race and identity?
At least for me, as I'm growing still, like my first interviews were very basic and I'm still learning. And I think as I've gotten further and further it's almost like the conversations have now elevated. Like we're talking a little bit deeper into things. We're talking more about what can be done, how it impacts the community, how it impacts ourselves. So I think the levels of conversations, depending on my guests, and it goes up and down, which is fine because we all are different people. And that's what I want to keep having is some are going to be brilliant and some will be like, look, it's just little old me. Let me tell you my story. Okay, what do you need to tell us? What do we need to hear? So, and like I was telling you before we started, at least with me being a podcaster, it's opened up something in me where I can relate to almost anyone now, even at my job working, in admissions and records. When I talk to students, every student, they love me. They don't, in whatever background, as long as you chatting with them, telling them what they need to hear, by helping them, not needing, but the truth, and just having that connection and showing you care about whatever situation they have, no matter how minute, for that 5 minutes makes an impact. And it's very easy for me. And I think that's what the podcast has done for me personally. It's kind of made me confront my fears of I can go up and talk to anyone, just like my late mother. My late mother talked to everybody back home in New York, newspaper man, whatever, and then ends up being friends with them. That type of quality, and that's what I want to keep honing because I want more and more people to come on and talk and tell their stories and get more, you know what I mean? That's just my whole big thing. But that's the elevation I found within the conversations I'm having with many of my guests and then also my own self-growth.
Yeah, I love that. I think that, when you ask kind of what I would share with people or what I would want them to do or learn, I think it is that, like, listen to ourselves and each other, like, because our stories are so important. And also, yes, evolve, be willing to learn, be willing to grow, be willing to make mistakes. But I am thinking a lot now about the importance of mental health, the importance of being known and seen and heard, of getting support. I'm not going to lie, I have burnt out many times in my podcasting career and in my life and have needed to take some mental health breaks and some personal restoration breaks. And so I guess just like I want people to feel like they deserve to be met wherever they are and loved and known and held, and then also to do the same for others. The more I listen to people's stories, the more I realize I think we are all profoundly lonely, like just profoundly lonely, wanting to be loved, wanting to be cared for. And like even what you were sharing about earlier with some of the separatist groups and stuff, like I just feel like the way forward is to be more embracing of ourselves and other people, even those we don't understand. It's just like, yeah, I think empathy is huge, and self-care and boundaries.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And what's really interesting, because I'm piggybacking on what you just said about, I made impacts on certain people who've come on my show. They're like, I like you. I feel like I was all alone until I found your podcast, and then they come on my show. And I'm like, but there's so many out there, but people don't know that, So by chance, they just happened to see this and they said, I want to come on. And I didn't know there were so many people and so much community. And sometimes we're like that first step for a lot of people, which is another reason why I like doing a podcast. You know what I mean?
Yes. And I mean, it's great. And people can learn, and people can heal, and they can see themselves mirrored. And also, like, I am not a therapist, I'm not a therapist. I don't want to be a therapist.
Yes.
Got to help you if I were your therapist, and so it's a way, I think, that I can support people in feeling known and seen and heard when I don't have the bandwidth to. We interviewed 30 people. That was beautiful and wonderful. For this season, I think for DDP, and then 15 for the Youth Voices. I think for DDP, I've interviewed like 300 people. I've interviewed over 500 people in my career. Wonderful, meaningful work, and also very tiring, very, very draining. And so what I love about podcasting is you can put out this project and help thousands of people, tens of thousands of people, with first, someone who's kind of introverted like me, not having to engage with those thousands of people, because I'd be comatose in a corner somewhere if I tried to do that.
I love it, honey. I love it. All right, Daralyse, my darling, where can people follow you and the podcast? Because this is great stuff.
Oh my gosh, thanks. I would love that. So the On Being Biracial podcast is available anywhere people get their podcasts. It's On Being Biracial. They can also go to onbeingbiracial.com and connect with me there. I'm Daralyse Lyons, DARALYSELYONS, and I'm on all the social medias, and I have my own website as well that folks can go and find. But On Being Biracial is probably of the most interest to your audience.
Well, my darlings, I want to thank you for tuning in to our GMP podcast. We appreciate each and every one of you. I love you, my darlings. I love those of you who download and share and like. I love all y'all. Thank you for hanging in there with me. And if you want more engaging content, you're going to go to newwavemedia.org, because I am now partnered with them through Just J Mark. That is NUWAVEMEDIA.org. And make sure, my babies, you're going to subscribe to Generation Mix. Whether you listen to iHeart, Spotify, Spreaker, whatever, I'm on all those streaming platforms. Follow me on Instagram. I suck at Instagram right now because I be burned out, but I do have content on there. I will get back to the game. My Instagram handle is Generation Mix Podcast. So, and if y'all want to know more about New Wave Community Media, it's a nonprofit, and it's about digital literacy, education, safety, and supporting new voices. So you hook up with us, it's possible you may end up with a podcast of your own as well, as long as you're committed and you're willing to do it. This stuff is exciting, y'all. So, my darlings, this concludes another episode of what it means to be mixed race in America, one story at a time, from the studio to the streets. Good night, my loves.